Welcome to The Kill File, your favorite true crime podcast. I'm your host, Brittany Spears. Each week, we will explore the dark corners of true crime, unsolved mysteries, and murder. Join me as we uncover secrets, investigate evidence, and dive into the chilling details of some of the most fascinating cases. Get ready for a journey into the dark unknown, because in The Kill File, nothing stays buried forever. Hey guys, welcome to episode 28 of The Kill File. I am so glad you guys are back for part 2 of the Yorkshire Ripper. This mountain of a case where 23 women were attacked, 13 killed, 10 survived, this monster's reign of terror. I have no business today because this is going to be another long one, so I think that we should just jump in. A little reminder from last week, we met the serial killer named Peter Sutcliffe, aka the Yorkshire Ripper. We were able to cover women who were attacked by this piece of shit and survived, and then we were able to cover the first murder victim named Wilma McCann. We are going to start part 2 by talking about his second murder of a woman named Emily Jackson. Trigger warnings for today is murder, brutality, body mutilation, and description of corpses. Peter said during the time of the first murder he was working at a place called Common Road Tire Services in Oakenshaw, and that he tried to act as normal as possible as to not be suspicious. He would then go on to kill another woman just a few months later in January of 1976. A 42-year-old woman named Emily Jackson, who was a sex worker, would unfortunately be his next victim. After Emily was found to be the Yorkshire Ripper's next victim, it's said that her family and friends were shocked to find out that she was doing sex work part-time. Emily was married to a man named Sidney at the time, who was a contractor for roofing, and Emily was said to help Sidney with the paperwork and drove him to job sites. Emily would drive Sidney in a quote-unquote old Commer van because Sidney didn't drive at the time. It was said that around the holiday season is when Emily decided to turn to sex work in the evening from men that she was able to pick up from her pub adventures. It was stated that it was Emily's game plan to cruise around the streets of Chapeltown searching for business for the evening, and sometimes she would even leave her van in the parking lot and join clients in their own vehicles. One place that Emily was said to hang around often was the Gaiety pub, and this was located on Roundhay Road in Leeds. On January 20th, 1976, Sidney and Emily would head out to the Gaiety pub, where Emily would leave her husband shortly after their arrival to quote-unquote have a look around. Unfortunately, Peter Sutcliffe would see Emily shortly after 7 p.m., where she told Peter that it would cost him £5 for her company. Emily would then get into Peter's car, where the pair would drive and then park on a piece of land that was abandoned, and this was away from the main road and any lights. Peter would later say, quote, "I remember when she got in, there was an overpowering smell of cheap perfume and sweat. This served all the more for me to hate this woman, even though I didn't know her. Looking back, I can see how the first murder had unhinged me completely." End quote. Ugh. His description of her makes me want to stab him with a fork. Cheap perfume and sweat? I hate him. Peter then decided to pretend that his car wouldn't start. I don't know exactly why, but maybe it was to get her in a vulnerable position so that he could attack her more easily. When Emily took out a lighter to try to help Peter look under the hood of his car, he then took a few steps back and hit her with his hammer twice, and she fell onto the road. I cannot imagine the pain of being hit anywhere with a hammer, especially when he hits these women in the head. These poor women didn't deserve this. It's just so sad. Peter then dragged Emily into what was said to be a yard, and this is where he would again push up her, quote, sweater, cardigan, and bra and pull down her pants, end quote. Again with the pants, the shirt. I don't believe for a second that this was about sight. He would then horrifically stab Emily 52 times in the back, lower abdomen, breasts, and neck. This just seemed so frenzied and manic and full of rage. 52 times? There's no way that he needed to expose her to see if he stabbed her 52 times. She wasn't going to live, and you knew that, so don't feed me your bullshit. He stabbed Emily to death with a sharpened screwdriver. This next sentence is going to be very graphic, so just a warning. Peter then, quote, searched the yard until he found a piece of wood between 2 and 3 feet long and thrust it between her legs, end quote. Wow. I am without words to the absolute depravity of this man. Sickening. He raped this woman with a piece of wood. This is why I have a hard time believing that he didn't sexually assault or rape these women either before, during, or after he killed them. We will later get into what he said about the murder of Emily, where he will explain a little of his thoughts and actions. After this vicious attack, Peter was trying to leave the scene. Apparently a car stopped and kind of scared Peter when the vehicle had only stopped a few short yards away from him, so he quickly put the murder weapons, the hammer and the screwdriver, onto the floor of the car and was said to have driven straight home to his in-laws that was in Clayton, Bradford. So Emily's husband, Sidney, after the bars were closing around 10:30 p.m., left Gaiety Pub and went to the parking lot where he saw her van, but he didn't see his wife. He waited a few more minutes for her, but after not seeing her, Sidney took a taxi home thinking that his wife could be at another bar or with a client at the time. So this whole time I was wondering if Sidney knew that Emily did sex work on the side or not, and this is when I would find out that he did. I wanted to throw in some thoughts of if her husband knew her side work and supported her, how neat that was of him, but I don't know their relationship and if it was a subject of contention or not, if he was accepting of this work, so I don't want to speculate and I will keep my opinions to myself. Around 8:10 a.m. the next morning, there would be a labor worker who was taking what was said to be a shortcut that was through the narrow passage between Manor Street and Round Hay Road. As this man was walking towards the end of the smaller cul-de-sac between the two abandoned buildings, he would see something that caught his eye. There was said to be an item that was bulky and was covered partially with a coat. This is when the worker would stumble upon the remains of Emily Jackson. Shortly after, the authorities would show up to the scene and noticed that Emily's body had been left in an obscene way. Emily had been left with her legs apart while positioned on her back. At the scene, the authorities would also notice drag marks on the ground that would indicate that Emily's murderer would have drug her body to this exact spot. On Emily's right thigh, the authorities could see a boot mark that would later be identified as a brand of boots called Dunlop Warwick. The size of the boot mark was said to be around a size 7, but definitely no bigger than a size 8 shoe print. A little further into the sand, there was said to be the same type of boot print. The authorities thankfully were able to link this murder quickly to that of Wilma McCann. I say thankfully because there are cases where murders are so similar, but the authorities fail to make the connections and it takes even longer to solve because of it. Peter Sutcliffe later in his confessions would say about Emily's murder, quote, "This time I drove to Leeds looking for a prostitute because I felt I could not justify what I had done previously, and I felt an inner compulsion to kill a prostitute. This was about a month after Christmas." End quote. Wow. So the authorities thought they would have a break they needed in the case when about a week after Emily's murder, a sex worker ended up coming forward stating that she was chatting with Emily Jackson just outside the Gaiety on the night that she was killed. The sex worker, who came forward by the name of Maria Sellers, would go on to tell the police that her conversation with Emily was just before 7 p.m. and when Emily would spot a potential client that night, she saw her walk over to the man's vehicle and then she would get into this man's Land Rover. It was said that Maria was able to give a very good description of the driver of the Land Rover, and she was also able to see the pair drove off towards Gledhow Road. The authorities were able to question other sex workers and gain enough detail of the man to know that he was most likely of Irish descent. Authorities would also learn of an attack on a sex worker that had an incident with a man in March of 1975. Barbara Miller was looking for clients when she would be picked up from a pub that was in the Lum Lane area of Bradford in a Land Rover. Barbara would later tell the authorities this man had an Irish accent and that he would drive her to Bolton Woods. She would further say that when the vehicle came to a stop, this man would open the passenger door and demand she exit the vehicle. When Barbara would refuse to get out, which I would too, that's fucking scary, the man would then drag her out of the Land Rover. There was a struggle between the two where the man would punch her in the face, in the chest, and in the stomach. Ugh, this made my stomach hurt to think of this poor woman being beaten in this way, not knowing what she did or why he was doing this to her. It was then said that she didn't report the attack to the authorities, which killed me for her. Nothing ever came of the Irishman who could have been Emily's customer right before she would get into Peter's car, never to be seen again. I hate to think that this man just got to walk around free and who knows what else he did to another woman or other sex workers. I hate that for them and I wish that he had been brought to justice. Again, speaking about the murder of Emily, Peter would go on to say that, quote, "She had an overcoat on, she was heavily built and had brown hair. She said she knew where we could go. I knew from the outset I didn't want intercourse with her. I just wanted to get rid of her. At that time, I think I was dressed in my working clothes. At the time, I used to wear Wellington boots at work." End quote. Oh, this motherfucker. I hate everything about him. Can you imagine how hard he had to have stomped on this woman's thigh to leave a print like that? The way he talks about these women is just so disrespectful and gross. He knew he didn't want to have sex with her? Then let her go, you piece of shit. Is that why he used a piece of wood to rape her? What an absolute putrid monster of a human being. Peter would go on to confess that he was in a frenzied state while he brutally stabbed this woman to death with a screwdriver all over her poor body. He used the word seething to describe the hate that he had for Emily. I really want to know the pathology of this man and why he had such a rage for sex workers or women in general. He then spoke to the fact that he had a feeling of what he described as justification and satisfaction for what he had just done to Emily. I'm sorry, what? Justification and satisfaction for brutally attacking and raping Emily with an object? This man is a whole different kind of monster. He would then go on to talk about how his clothes were relatively blood-free, so he didn't have to get rid of his clothes. Peter would go on to state that he was unable to recall if he had used the same hammer on both women that he had just now killed, but then he said he did remember getting a new hammer from a nearby hardware shop. He further explained that this new hammer, from the description, seemed to be a claw hammer, and the one he had used before was a ball-peen hammer. Can you imagine working at that hardware store, just innocently selling a hammer to a man and never knowing that he was buying this hammer with the intention of bashing women's skulls in with it? I can't imagine finding out later I was the one who sold it to this beast. Moving on to the year of 1977, and this murder took place on February 5th. So it was odd to me that this disgusting human had waited an entire year before attacking his next victim. Come to find out that he didn't. The women he attacked after the first two by the name of Marcella Claxton survived. Peter would go on to murder his next victim in the exact same spot where he attacked Marcella, and she was able to escape. So I guess Marcella was on her way home from a party located in Chapeltown, Leeds, when Peter would mistake her for a sex worker. Marcella refused his request because she was not a sex worker, but she did ask him for a ride home. Marcella would describe Peter as a white man who had dark eyes and black hair. She stated that his eyes made him a little scary, but she wanted a ride and got in. She said not long after getting in the vehicle, she realized that they weren't headed in the right direction towards her house. Marcella would then go on to say that she had known about the two women who were brutally murdered, and this is when she became scared and tried to open the door so that she could escape, but she couldn't. Peter would drive Marcella towards Roundhay Park, and when he pulled the vehicle over, Marcella asked if she could go down to the bathroom, and he allowed her to walk towards some bushes. Marcella would then crouch down, and this is when Peter would attack her before he drove off. She would say about the attack, quote, "The pain was awful, and there was blood everywhere. I thought I was going to die," end quote. I cannot imagine the pain, as I said before, of being attacked in the head with a hammer. Marcella, you are a strong, strong woman. She was able, after the attack, to make it to a nearby phone box. And when I looked this up to make sure that I knew what it was, it's those red phone booths that are like iconic for British culture. While she was waiting, she saw Peter's car headed back towards the scene of the attack, back towards her. Marcella explained that she feared that he was coming back to see if she was really dead, and that when he realized she wasn't, he would finish her off. Holy shit, can you fucking imagine being attacked by this crazy fucker? And then being in pain and bleeding profusely, and then being strong and brave enough to make it to the phone just to see this scary-ass man driving back towards you. The panic that she must have felt in that moment. I can imagine that she had just pure terror, the kind that makes her whole body go cold as he was driving towards her. I cannot imagine. Oh my God. Marcella would go on to say that she was able to stay crouched down as she saw Peter again drive away. She would go on to need more than 50 stitches after the attack, as well as brain surgery. Right after this, I read that Marcella was actually 4 months pregnant when Peter attacked her, and unfortunately, she would suffer a miscarriage. One source said that Peter Sutcliffe, following his arrest, wasn't able to be legally held accountable for her miscarriage. I am so sorry for Marcella having to suffer so much at the hands of this prick. She would further say that after she reported Peter to the authorities, that everyone went on to think that she was a sex worker when she wasn't. But they thought that's why she was attacked by the Ripper. She said, quote, "I wasn't, but people gave me dirty looks, even my own parents," end quote. This makes me so fucking mad. This woman was viciously attacked by this man, had to have surgery on her brain, 50 stitches, fought for her life, suffered a miscarriage, but because people thought that she was a sex worker, they gave her sideways looks? What in the actual fuck is wrong with people? This woman is a victim, and people were treating her different because what they thought she did for a living. I don't understand this. Why do people do this? This is what I mean when I say that people in society treated and still sometimes treat people differently if they are sex workers or are quote unquote in their eyes less than themselves. These are fucking people. We are all human beings with families and loved ones, and who the fuck are we to judge anyone else? None of us on this earth are perfect, moral, or virtuous beings, so why do we get on our high horses when we think we are above other people? I wish we could all see each other as humans. I am guilty of this too, not so much with sex workers, because I don't see a lot where I live, or at least I don't think I do, but with homeless people or drug addicts on the street. I find myself with not as much sympathy for them as I wish I was able to conjure. I get scared of people who I think are going to be unpredictable, and I avoid them at all costs. I wish that I was able to realize in that moment that they're just going through some shit and that I am no better. In fact, I should be in that moment fucking thankful for my life turning out the way it did and for the good choices I made and my own ability to pull myself out of some seriously horrific slumps that I've had in my life. Hindsight is always 20/20. I hope that we can start to treat each other with the respect and dignity that we all deserve regardless of what we are going through. I, for one, am going to try harder to do that myself. Anyways, Marcella would go on to state that she was able to describe Peter Sutcliffe with enough detail that an accurate facial composite was able to be derived, but unfortunately, the police didn't use this. Why? Oh my God. She would go on to say that she feels as if the authorities had listened to her, that they would have been able to catch Peter earlier. She said, quote, "There would have been no more killing. They asked me the same things over and over, but they didn't listen. They didn't believe me. If only they had listened to the description I gave, they might have caught him earlier and all those poor women would have not died." End quote. Sickening. So on a lighter note, Marcella Claxton, back in October of 2023 when this article was written, was now 67 years old. She was able to have 3 children and now had 6 grandbabies. Marcella still suffers, even now, nearly 50 years later, from the psychological and physical scars from her attack. She says that Peter Sutcliffe had ruined her life and that she can't escape what happened to her and suffers in pain every single day where he hit her. Poor thing, I can't imagine how horrific. She went on to say that she suffers blackouts, gets dizzy spells and headaches, often which have not only caused her to fall, but she's also been forced to retire from a job she had as a cleaner of schools. Before we move on to Peter's next victim, I want to let you guys know that there is now a show about the Yorkshire Ripper called The Long Shadow, and it's an ITV drama. I'm not sure if that's something that we can get here in the US or not, but I will definitely be looking this up after I complete this case. If you guys have watched it, let me know your thoughts on it. Peter's next victim was a woman named Irene Richardson, who was only 28 years old when she was murdered in almost the exact same spot that Marcella was attacked. This would take place about 9 months after the attack on Marcella, so a little bit of down period before ramping back up on the attacks. On February 5th, 1977, Irene, who was not really in the best place in her life, had spent the last 10 days before this homeless and without any sort of income or money to her name. The last place that Irene would be seen was in what was called a rooming house on a street called Cowper, and this is where she was able to rent a room. She had stated that she was going to head over to a pub and disco called Tiffany's, and this was located in the center of Leeds. Irene would leave the rooming house around 11:15 that evening, never to be seen again, unfortunately. That same night, Peter Sutcliffe was on the hunt for another victim, and he was cruising around in his white Ford Corsair, and up until now, he had either turned down or had been turned down his approaches to women. This is when Peter would spot Irene, and this was not far from the Gaiety pub. Peter pulled his vehicle over a little bit in front of her, and it was said that Irene got in the car without a word. It was said that when Peter said something to the tune of possibly not wanting her, Irene told Peter that she was going to show him a quote-unquote good time. Peter then drove the pair about a mile towards Roundhay Park, then he proceeded on to Soldiers Field, and this is where he had attacked Marcella Claxton. Irene then exited the vehicle saying that she needed to use the bathroom. Unfortunately, the restrooms were locked, so she had to go in the grass. Peter had already slipped a hammer and knife into his pocket. While Irene was crouching, Peter, quote, delivered 3 heavy blows to her head with his hammer, one that drove her skull 3/4 of an inch into her brain. And then he tore open her jacket and blouse and began to stab and slash her with his Stanley knife, end quote. Just absolutely brutal and horrific. This is when Peter would actually hear some voices not far from them, and he also saw a car driving away from the block of flats nearby. Before Peter left the scene of the attack, he did something that he had never done in the past attacks. He actually took the time to rearrange her clothing and boots, and then he covered her with a coat. Weird. The next morning around 7:30 a.m., there was a man out jogging in Soldiers Field when this man named John Bolton would see the deceased body of Irene on the ground. John would later state that at first he just thought that she was sick, and he asked her what was wrong. It wasn't until he approached her body and moved the hair away from her face when he was able to see the blood on her neck, and then said that her eyes were staring out and glazed over. This is when he would run to a nearby house and call the police. Can you imagine finding this poor woman thinking that she was just sick and not doing so well, and then when you move her hair, you see her eyes staring out and blood everywhere? Holy shit. I can imagine that is something that will stick with you for the rest of your life. When the authorities arrived, they would see that the scene where Irene had been laying face down with her head turned towards the left and her hands underneath her stomach. The authorities could see that Irene's hair was completely drenched in blood, and her hair was actually concealing some of the stab wounds on her throat and on her neck. The coat that she had been wearing was the coat that Peter had covered her up with after his attack, which was said to be a suede coat with fur trimming. The authorities saw that Irene's boots were carefully placed over her thighs, and that while her bra was still in place, her skirt was pulled up and her tights were pulled down and off of her right leg, which, if she was going to the bathroom as he attacked her, makes sense. We're actually going to see that this is somewhat of a pattern with Peter. He attacks the women when they're in their most vulnerable state, just going pee in the grass. The next part is gnarly, just a warning. It was also seen that Irene had stab wounds to her stomach, neck, and throat. The 3 stab wounds that were to her stomach, one of which was so big that one slash was said to be over 6 inches long, and they noticed all of these stabs were in a downward stroke, and the largest one had caused Irene's intestines to fall out of the wounds. During Peter's confessions, as he retold the story, in my opinion, he seemed very clinical and cold and just very matter-of-fact. One quote from this retelling of the murder, he said, quote, "By this time, after Richardson killing, prostitutes became an obsession with me and I couldn't stop myself. It was like some sort of drug," end quote. The next victim of the Yorkshire Ripper wouldn't come long after the last. This time, a 32-year-old woman named Patricia Atkinson would be attacked on April 23, 1977. So only 2 months or so after the last one. Patricia, who went by the nickname of Tina, was said to be living at the time in a smaller flat that was on Oak Avenue. That night, Tina was out drinking at the Perseverance in Lum Lane, Bradford. This was said to be where Peter started to expand the locations of his attacks. Tina, on the night of her attack, had been dressed in a short leather coat, some jeans, and a blue shirt that wasn't buttoned, mostly. She was very intoxicated as she left the Perseverance and headed towards another pub she liked to hang out at, and this was called the Carlisle. This was actually pretty close to her home, and when she was at the Carlisle, the manager decided to cut her off. Tina had announced that she would be leaving and stumbled out of the bar around 10:15 or 10:30 that night. Apparently, Tina did not head towards her home after being cut off from the Carlisle, but instead, she started walking towards another pub that she fancied called the International. There were several witnesses who had seen Tina stumbling around on the road that evening up until around 11 o'clock that night. Peter was out driving the streets of Manningham, most likely on the hunt. He would see Tina stumbling around on the road and he knew she was heavily intoxicated or worse for drink, as they would say over there. Peter witnessed Tina banging her fists on the roof of a car that had been parked, and she was shouting profanities at seemingly no one. When Peter stopped his car by Tina, she got into the vehicle without Peter having to convince her. When she got into the car with Peter, she said that she had lived not far from where they were in a flat. As they got out of the car on Oak Lane, Peter had grabbed his claw hammer from where he kept it under his seat, and he concealed the hammer inside of his coat. Ugh, I just want to run up to this poor woman and save her and tell her what's about to happen to her. It's heartbreaking. Once the pair went inside, Peter hung up his coat and took out the hammer and bashed Tina over the head with it 4 times, extremely hard. Tina then fell off the bed onto the floor where blood started gushing everywhere. Peter hit her yet again, lifted Tina under the arms back onto the bed, and lifted up her shirt and bra, exposing her breasts, and pulled down her jeans and underwear. Peter would then start to hit Tina with the hammer and then started clawing her with the other side. He left Tina's body with some marks that were seemingly odd, and he had also stabbed her in the stomach 6 times. It was also stated that Peter tried to stab her in the back as well, leaving some long slashing marks on her left side. He then threw some sheets from her bed over top of her before leaving. Peter later admitted that when he was leaving, he could still hear some quote-unquote gurgling noises, but that he wasn't worried about it because he knew that her condition was bad and that she wouldn't be able to tell anyone what had just happened to her. After attacking Tina, Peter went home and noticed that there was blood on his jeans, which he promptly rinsed and wiped all of the blood off his boots as well. Later on, he would take the hammer that he had used on Tina and he would throw it onto the ground near a bridge. A man who worked the grounds near the bridge would go on to find the hammer and use it for work for the next few years. Wouldn't there have been blood on the hammer when this dude found it? You wouldn't put 2 and 2 together when you have probably read about the attacks on all of these women with hammers? That's crazy to me. Even if I wasn't in the know of what was going on, if I found a hammer in the middle of nowhere with some blood on it, I'm heading straight to the police with that thing. Fuck that. No one needs a free hammer that badly. The next day around 6:30 p.m., Tina's friend Robert Henderson, who she had been friends with for a long time, went to go check on her. But when she didn't come to the door, her friend tried the handle and discovered that the door was unlocked. Robert then slowly opened the door and made his way into her flat when he noticed a pool of blood on the floor. He then discovered a large ball of something covered up with sheets and could see on Tina that what was uncovered was her face, which was white as well as her arm, and then he noticed blood on the pillow. He knew in that moment that his friend was deceased. Robert then ran over to the building manager, Jack Robinson, and he was yelling and shouting, saying that someone was murdered. The authorities were able to take a blood sample and test it for alcohol, and this would reveal that Tina had actually about 20 drinks. So, quite a bit of alcohol, which, wow, girl, you could put it away. I would have been firmly on my ass. The authorities were able to find a footprint that was bloody on what was said to be the bottom sheet of the bed, and this would turn out to be a size 7 boot, and you guessed it, the print matched the Dunlop Warwick Wellington boot. About this murder, Peter would confess, quote, "When I first hit her, she was making a horrible gurgling sound, and she carried on making this noise even though I'd hit her a few times. She was still making a gurgling noise when I left, but I knew she would not be in a state to tell anybody." End quote. Do you see how callous and cold this motherfucker is when he talks about the women he savagely attacked and murdered? It's like he's explaining a night of total normalcy, like an uneventful evening, no regard for her life at all. It's sick. Okay, guys, a few things to keep in mind as we move on to the next victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. 1, Peter Sutcliffe is married. Yeah, don't forget that. He often talks about how he would commit these acts and then he would go home and his wife was usually in bed, which I think is why she probably didn't notice anything, but I wonder what he was telling her that he was doing all those times. Also, remember that Peter initially wanted to go after sex workers only, and while he still had that anger and hatred for them, he had now clearly attacked women that were definitely not sex workers, and with that he has strayed away from his victim profile a bit, although the next victim would supposedly be the first murder he convicted of a non-sex worker. Okay, so this next victim is only 16 years old. Her name is Jane McDonald. She was working as a shop assistant who had recently just left school. On Saturday, June 25th, 1977, Jane was meeting friends near the center of Leeds at the pub called Hofbrauhaus. Sorry if I butchered that. And this was apparently a German beer keller, or a German pub where they would sell some German beers. While Jane was there, she had met an 18-year-old named Mark Jones, and this would be the young man she danced with that evening, which was said to be around 10:30 p.m. The two left the establishment with a crowd of other people, and everyone had been heading towards the direction of Briggate, which was known to be the main street where you could go shopping. Jane then suggested the pair grab some grub of fish and chips. When they finally found a place and had eaten, it was too late for Jane to catch another bus as the last one was gone. The two young'uns sat on a bench together until about midnight, and then the two would walk towards where Mark lived, which was said to be on an estate near St. James Hospital, and this is when Mark would tell Jane that if his sister was home, then she could probably give Jane a ride back to her house. When they had arrived towards Mark's house and realized his sister wasn't home, the two continued walking right past his house and towards the direction of Chapeltown, which is towards where Jane lived. It was said that at this time, the couple had laid down in a field until about the hour of 1 a.m., when the two would part ways outside of the main gates of the hospital around 1:30 a.m. The pair had agreed that they wanted to try and meet up again towards the middle of this week. It was at this point that Jane tried to call a taxi, but when she received no response, she ended up walking, where she would pass the Grandways supermarket, which is where Jane was said to be employed at the time. She continued on in the general direction of her home, unfortunately having to pass the Gaiety, the same pub that Emily Jackson was taken from. Jane was walking along the street Chapeltown Road towards Reginald Street, which is where her home was, living only a handful of houses away from where Wilma McCann lived, the first murder victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. This same evening of June 25th, Peter spent the night hanging out with friends, and these two were neighbors of Peter and his wife Sonia, where they were living with her parents at the time. The three had gone out drinking, and afterwards Peter was said to have dropped his buddies off, and instead of going home, he headed to Leeds, where his quote-unquote hunting grounds were. Peter would spot Jane walking around 2 a.m. that morning, so into the next day. So technically this would be now June 26th. Peter was said to have then parked and watched her walking for a few moments before exiting his car with the kitchen knife from under his seat, and of course his hallmark hammer. Peter was under the assumption that Jane was a sex worker because she was walking in the area that was known to be home to various sex workers, but Peter also claimed that he saw her stop and talk to a few women that were on the street corner. Peter then started to follow her, saying that Jane never looked up and never looked around even though he was following her very close. This makes me so sad because I know for me I'm constantly paying attention to what's going on around me because I don't trust people. I wish that Jane had had the same thought at 2 a.m. that the psycho that was known to be lurking the area could be around. She was probably just so caught up in the thoughts that the boy that she had just met and was so excited to see him again. You know that feeling in the beginning of a relationship where you're just like giddy and excited and can't stop thinking about your new interest, especially at the age of 16. After walking near a playground on Reginald Street, Peter was close enough to hit Jane. He took out his hammer and struck her on the back of the head, and she fell onto the ground. He drug her face down into the playground and back into the corner. He hit her a second time with the hammer and proceeded to pull up her clothes and stab her in the chest and in the back. The next morning, and this is horrible, 2 children were headed to the playground when they would discover the body of Jane McDonald. The authorities were able to see where Jane had been attacked because of the blood splatter and blood trail seen on the pavement. Jane's body was found face down with her halter neck pulled up, exposing her stomach area and her skirt in disarray. I hate this man for not only his heinous crimes, but for also letting people find their bodies this way, and so far, we have had 2 sets of children finding the victims, which you know traumatized these poor kids for the rest of their lives. Jane was found to have been hit 3 times with the hammer in the head, and Peter had stabbed her about 25 times in the chest and back. 25 times, holy shit. They found one stabbing in a particular area that Peter had stabbed over and over on her chest. The authorities were able to tell that through some of the blood smears on Jane's back that he had tried to clean off his knife. When the authorities were able to turn over Jane's body, they saw that there was a broken bottle with the lid still on it that had dug into her chest. It was later claimed to have happened during the time Peter dragged her. During the examination after her death, Jane was found to have not drank any alcohol but only sodas that evening, which really hurts to hear because that means that she didn't have anything to help with the pain of what was happening to her. At least if she had had some alcohol in her system, maybe it wouldn't have hurt so much. I can only imagine. After Jane's death, the public was outraged that this young girl was killed and was not a sex worker, and the rest were. Because Jane was seemingly innocent, her murder went national as well. And because of the outrage in this case, Chief Constable at the time, who was Ronald Gregory, would appoint the most senior and seemingly most qualified detective to cover the case, and this would be Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield. About this murder, Peter was said to have claimed that he thought Jane was a sex worker, as he had been watching her for a little bit before he attacked her. He also stated that when he dragged her into the corner, that her shoes made a horrible sound on the ground as they were scraping. He then said, quote, "When I saw in the papers that MacDonald was so young and was not a prostitute, I felt like someone inhuman, and I realized that it was a devil driving me against my will, and that I was a beast. When the Ripper came up in conversation at work or in a pub, I was able to detach my mind from the fact that it was me they were talking about, and I was able to discuss it normally. This amazed me at the time that I was able to do this." End quote. I love how he supposedly felt bad when he found out that she was young and was not a sex worker. Are you kidding me? You felt that your actions were all right if it was a sex worker, a mother, someone's daughter, a cousin, an aunt, but if she wasn't a sex worker, you felt bad? Bullshit. Also, I'm going to go ahead and call bullshit on the supposed devil that was taking over him. Nope, you're just a sick piece of shit. The next victim that we are going to talk about is Maureen Long. Maureen was a 42-year-old woman who had left her home on the night of July 9th, which was located in Farsley, Leeds, and she was headed out for a fun night in Bradford. She was said to have gone to various pubs that night and even had met up with her husband, who at the time they were estranged, but this night she made arrangements to stay at his home in Bradford. One of the last pubs that Maureen was at ended up being the Mecca Ballroom, which was renamed Tiffany's in Manningham, Bradford. Many people remember seeing Maureen in the Bali High discotheque, dancing with many men, and it was speculated that she seemed quite toasty by the time she had left, which was said to be a little after 2 a.m. That same evening, Peter was out drinking with Ronnie and David Barker in the area of Bradford as well. This evening would be similar to what happened to Jane in that Peter dropped off the Barkers and then went out on the hunt. When Peter spotted Maureen coming out of Tiffany's, he pulled over after going slowly behind her for a bit, and it was clear that she was unsteady as she passed all of the people waiting on taxis that evening. Peter asked if she was going far. Maureen questioned if he was offering her a ride. He told her he was if she wanted one. When she got into his car, she told him where she was living, which was near an area that was run down by railroad yards called Bowling. While she guided him towards her house, but said not to stop right in front of it, she had mentioned that she was living with an ex-boxer, and she had described him as quote-unquote a spoil sport. When Maureen asked if Peter fancied her, he acknowledged that he did, and this is when Maureen said that they could go inside if there was no one home. She came back to the car, and she said of a place she knew that they could go. When they got to the little spot, Maureen got out to pee, and while crouching, Peter hit her on the back of the head with his hammer. She fell to the ground, and this is when he would proceed to rip her dress to her waist, and then he started stabbing her like he did with the other women. A quote-unquote night watchman was patrolling through the area, and he was then alerted by his Alistane barking when he saw what he believed to be a white Ford Cortina Mark with a dark roof, but this is actually a Ford Corsair driving away from the area at a high speed. The night watchman saw that the time was 3:27 a.m. Later on at 8:30 a.m., Maureen was discovered by two women who were talking and walking near the area when they heard Maureen crying out. At first, it was said that the women thought that this was a baby crying or whimpering. Maureen was found in an awful scene. Her garments were pulled down, including her tights, pants, and girdle. Remember, she was going to the bathroom when he hit her. She had stab wounds in her stomach, back, and chest, and one slash would extend from her breasts to below her belly button. When police arrived, they were able to spot a partial bloody palm print they believed belonged to her attacker on a part of a broken sink. Apparently, Peter was in shock the next day when he found out that his victim had survived. He felt that this would be the end for him and that she would be able to identify him, but unfortunately Maureen suffered from amnesia. Maureen did have memory of little things like the white Ford with a black roof. However, she gave a description of her attacker as a white man who was well built and was about 36 or 37 years old. She then said that she thought him to have puffy cheeks with thick eyebrows and wiry blonde hair, with it being collar length. She also said he had noticeably large hands, and because of this description, Peter was able to relax a little. Although he did have some concern about the night watchman being able to describe his car. That August, he would end up selling his car to Ronnie Baker, the wife of David Baker. Apparently, the vehicle had then broke down, so he took it back and stripped it down and used various parts for the replacement car that he had bought in September, this time a red Corsair. I hate to say this, but a serial killer who changes out his car will definitely be harder to catch if people are focused on one particular car. I don't like that this sick fuck is cunning as well. About this attack, Peter said, quote, "The next one was Maureen Long. I saw Maureen just a couple of weeks ago. I was in the Arndale shopping center with my wife when I came face to face with her. I recognized her immediately. She seemed to look at me, but she obviously didn't recognize me." End quote. Oh man, I wish she could have. Can you imagine his fear in that moment that she would know who he was? He would also go on to explain the attack and then say, quote, "My desire to kill prostitutes was getting stronger than ever, and it took over me completely. I was in a dilemma. I wanted to tell someone what I was doing, but I thought about how it would affect my wife and family. I wasn't too much bothered for myself." End quote. I don't believe him for a second that he wanted to tell someone about what he was doing. I feel like he was enjoying the rush that he got from the hatred for sex workers, or he would have stopped. Right then and there, he could have just stopped. But he didn't, of course. He's full of shit. Peter's next victim would be only 20 years old, and this attack would take place on October 1st, 1977. I feel like these are getting so close together. Remember, he sold his car and bought a new one in September, so I feel like maybe he laid low for just those few weeks until he was able to switch out cars, since the night watchman saw his car. Jean Jordan, who was also known as Jean Royal, who was a sex worker, would be attacked in the Manchester area, showing that the Yorkshire Ripper was expanding his area of attacks. It was said that the events of this attack on Jean would actually result with Peter leaving behind some sort of clue that would be directly traced to him. When he tried to go back to Jean's body 9 days later to try to retrieve the evidence that would incriminate him, he was unable to, and when Peter failed to do this, he would commit the worst attack and mutilations on any of his prior victims. Ugh, what a fucking loser. Jean was nicknamed Scotch Jean by other sex workers who knew her, and she was living with the common-law husband at the time named Alan Royal. And they together had 2 children living in a flat on Linebeck Crescent. You guys should check out her photo. I will be posting the victims for each episode that week, and Jean just seemed naturally beautiful. Not that it matters when it comes to being a victim of murder. I just noticed how happy, content, and pretty she looks in her picture. Knowing that she was the mother of 2 just kills me. Alan had gone out the night of October 1st with a group of friends, and when he returned home, he realized that his wife, Jean, was not at home, but his kids were there, sleeping. Alan would just assume that Jean had also gone out with some friends, and when she didn't return the next day, he just assumed that she went to visit her family in Scotland, which she often did unannounced, apparently. This makes me sad because when no one knows where you are, but you are someone who will just up and leave, it can make finding you so much harder. Back on September 26th, as when Peter and Sonia had moved into their home in Heaton, Bradford after living with her parents for a while. After working on his new used car, the red Corsair that he had bought, he had decided to test it out and drove towards what was said to be the red light district of Moss Side, and this is in the Manchester area. Not long after 9 p.m., while Peter was driving around on the hunt, he saw numerous sex workers, and this is when Peter said to have picked one out that he described as, quote, slim and not bad looking. When he asked her if she was conducting business, she had told him that she would meet him a little further down the road. He also said that apparently she was going to get into another car when she saw Peter in his red Corsair and changed her mind. Peter would go on to say, quote, I suppose this was the biggest mistake she had ever made. She told me she was going to go with another man until she saw me. Oh my God, I hate this man. I am again learning this right along with you, so I don't know yet how he gets caught or if he ends up with the death penalty or life in prison or whatever. But right in this moment, hearing him say that it was her biggest mistake to get into his car, still putting the blame on the women who do sex work as their job, I want to watch this man hang. I have never wanted to see someone hanged in public where we can throw tomatoes and onions at him before now. I want to see him put in the stocks for a few months first, just standing there so uncomfortable, where we can throw shit at him, and then I want to see him hang. He doesn't deserve life on this earth, a heartless monster of a human being with no regard for others. I am still blown away that this man was married. I don't get it. So, Jean and Peter had haggled over the price for a few minutes, and they agreed on the usual amount, which was £5, and he was needing to pay first. After this, Jean showed Peter to a spot said to be on Princess Road, Chorlton, and this was near the Southern Cemetery. The area that the pair went to was said to be a good spot that was popular with the Moss Side sex workers because it was out of the view of traffic. There were some high hedges around. Peter was now armed with the hammer that the previous owner of the new house that Sonia and him had just bought had left behind. Peter was following Jean into the darkness of the wasteland some yards away from the car. When Peter first hit Jean with the hammer, she fell to the ground and was said to be moaning loudly. The Yorkshire Ripper then hit Jean 10 more times. While he was crouching over Jean's dead body, he had seen some headlights come on and he was able to hear an engine start. Peter knew that the car would be leaving the area, so he quickly pulled Jean's body near some bushes and tried to hide it. When the first car left, Peter was crouching behind his car and he had seen that a new car was coming in and it pulled right into the exact same place of where the first car left. Peter felt the chances of Jean's body being discovered were so high that he quickly jumped into his car and took off for home. As for the evidence he left behind that would be traced back to him, it was not the hammer, as you may think, but it was the £5 that he had paid Jean in advance. He realized that the note that he had given Jean was the one that had been included in, quote, his pay packet at Clark's only 2 days previously, and it was a newly minted note, end quote. So, Peter was then faced with two choices. Either turn around and go retrieve the note and chance being seen, or head home and wait it out. He made the decision to wait it out and see what happened. Peter was said to be surprised that there was nothing of his latest killing in the Monday paper. Nothing about how the Yorkshire Ripper was now operating for the very first time in Manchester. After each day that he saw no news of Jean's murder, he figured that he had just hid her body so well that no one was finding her. He also knew that the area was only really busy after it became dark. Jean had also not been reported missing. A week after Jean's murder, there was still no news about her body being found. Peter figured that she was still there and that no one had found her yet. This is when he would decide the night of him and Sonia's housewarming party on Sunday, October 9th, would be the perfect opportunity to go search for it. He took his parents back to their home, which was said to be in Bingley, after the party that evening, and this would be around 12 a.m. Instead of heading back home afterwards, he decided to go search for the note in Manchester with Jean's body. Within the next hour, he was parked by the same wasteland and set off to find Jean's body and retrieve the incriminating note. And this is where we are going to stop for part 2 of the Yorkshire Ripper. Do you think he will be spotted? You guys are going to have to wait until next week when we pick up where we left off in the Yorkshire Ripper case. Wow, this case is one for the books, right? I just can't believe the callousness of this beastly fucker who talks about these women as though they are just disposable and not women. He makes me sick. I am so saddened for the families of the women who are affected by this man, and I'm really curious to look more into the survivors and what they went on to do after their attacks. Since we have so many victims to cover, I probably won't include these searches, but I am just curious. What did you guys think about the way Peter Sutcliffe looks when you saw his picture from part 1? Doesn't he have just the most punchable face and smirk you have ever seen? I hope this fucker fries for everything that he has done. Oh, and before I forget, okay, this is going to be a little bit morbid, but hey, we're all here for the same thing, right? So I don't know if you guys were able to picture what it would be like in real life to be smashed in the skull with a hammer. It's easy for your brain to make these real women into story-like characters to protect you from the trauma, but I will tell you what I think of every time that I talk about these attacks on these women. Have you guys seen the miniseries called The Undoing? Holy shit. It's Hugh Grant and Nicole Kidman. I think I saw that you could watch it on Max or maybe rent it on Prime. There is this one scene in that series where you actually watch such a realistic version of what it would be like to see someone get smashed with a hammer. And let me tell you that it was so fucking scary, profound, and jolting that I could not get over what I just saw. Like, it will stick with you in ways that you don't think is possible. It fucked me up a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. I watched that part again the next day to try and process that it wasn't as bad as my mind was making it out to be, but it was, and it was still unbelievable. Do you guys ever do that? Like, you see something so horrific or fucked up and you're just shocked when it happens, and you get stuck with it, and you like have to see it again to like sort out your feelings and see if it was just in that moment or maybe it wasn't as bad as you thought? I've done this many times in my life, and only a handful of times has something stuck with me like this. Also, Hugh Grant in that series was phenomenal. I have always loved him since I watched the movie 9 Months when I was younger, but man, he is just so great in this one. Anyways, if you haven't watched it and you want to see a good psychological thriller where you're trying to figure out who the killer is the whole time, go watch it. And you'll see why it's popping out when you see the hammer scene. Holy shit. Anyways, I hope that you guys come on back next Monday for the next installment of the Yorkshire Ripper. We got through 7 victims in part 2, so we will probably be looking at 4 parts for the Yorkshire Ripper. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today, you guys. Thanks so much for hanging out with me and listening to another episode of The Kill File. Don't forget to check out the merch shop, either at thekillfile.com and click Shop Merch, or you can visit thekillfile.printify.me/products for some awesome true crime merch. Also, follow along on the Kill File's socials for posts about episodes, pictures about the cases, for updates, and more. We are on Facebook, Instagram, and X as The Kill File, and we are on YouTube and TikTok as The Kill File Podcast. Also, feel free to check out the website at thekillfile.com, where you can learn more about me, your host. You can learn a little bit more about how The Kill File got started, and you can suggest a case right there on the website. Let me know in your case suggestion if you want me to shout out your name if I cover your case. There is contact info on the site as well. You guys have no idea how much I love to hear from you. It makes my whole day. Come back on Mondays wherever you get your podcast fix when we will cover another case on the Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.